Hello everyone and welcome to the next show.
Hey everyone, great to see you again.
We have a great guest today.
Yes, we do. Our guest this week is Monika Bielskyte. She's a futurist and futures designer. And Monika is here to talk to us about utopias, dystopias, and the stories we tell about the future, how you can tell better future stories inside your organization. So I'm super excited to hear from Monika.
And she's one of the guests we invited in context of the next conference theme this year, which is Hug the System. So all the speakers on this season will be in connection with our theme, Hug the System, where we will discuss how to embrace systems and how to change systems from the within. And you have a thought to share on this as well.
Yes, I do. This is a thought about the long view and the future of democracy as a system. We're thinking a lot in this series of The Next Show about the systems that govern our lives and how to hug those systems, how to make those systems better. So I want to think for a second about the big system that governs society itself, and that is democracy. We know that in the 21st century, democracy faces some huge challenges, and sometimes we feel it creaking under those challenges. We talk a lot, for example, we've talked in The Next Show before, about disinformation, about deep fakes. It's very hard to run a deliberative democracy which is based on the sharing of ideas and debate when basic facts become controversial, and it's very hard to agree on a fundamental shared idea of reality. But I want to talk for a second about a different challenge, and that is short-termism. We face some huge long-term challenges in the 21st century. And foremost among them, of course, is climate change, a massive multi-decade, multi-century even challenge. And if we don't solve it, the planet is going to become unlivable for hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people. But there's a real problem with this, and that is our democracies and democratic politics are irredeemably short-term. We have politicians who are incentivized to think only to the next election and not very far beyond it. I mean, we all know that's not completely true. We do have politicians who are able to look, to the decades ahead, but they're only human, and it's very hard to shake the logic of a system that incentivizes our politicians only to think to the next election. But there is a new movement and a new way of thinking emerging now. It's called Longtermism. It's not often that a new ideology emerges, a new framework for ethics and for politics, but this could be it. And long-termist thinkers take a set of ideas. First is a question: what if all of human history so far is only the very beginning? What if we've only explored a tiny fraction of our potential? What if we can eventually go into the cosmos and fill the universe with human intelligence? The second is the realization that we ourselves are the greatest threat to our own future. We now possess, for the first time in history, the ability to destroy ourselves. Now, long-termists take those ideas and use them as the basis for a new ideology. And they say a couple of big things. First is, we should invest far more in thinking about existential risks to the future of humanity. The second is, when we make political decisions, we should factor in the impacts of those decisions for trillions of future humans who are not yet born. It's a very strange idea at first, this idea that we should consider trillions of humans out there in the future who do not exist yet. But I think we're going to hear a lot more about long-termism. A very well-known long-termist institution, the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University in the UK, recently delivered a report to the UK government about how to counter existential risks like the next pandemic, climate change, even meteor strike, events like that. We're going to hear a lot more about this philosophy. And look, one idea about how we enact some of these long-term ideas. Some people are starting to argue that we should scrap representative democracy, get rid of elections, and start to appoint our politicians just via a random lottery, the way we do with juries. Just appoint it that way, get 400 people inside a parliament who never have to think about elections, who don't have to worry about any of that stuff, and they will be liberated to truly think about the long term, the decades ahead, the centuries ahead. Now, clearly, we are a long way away from making those kinds of changes, but listen out for these kinds of long-termist ideas, because I think we'll hear a lot more about them in the coming decade. Okay, everyone, I am so excited to introduce yet another brilliant superstar guest here on the next show. Monika Bielskyte is a futurist and futures designer. Monika prototypes futures for media organizations, for technology companies, and for Hollywood too. She has clients ranging across Google, Nike, DreamWorks, Microsoft. The list is endless, it goes on. And Monika's latest project is called Protopia Futures. It's a platform for collaborative research that allows us to imagine futures beyond the usual utopia, dystopia cliches. How exciting does that sound? We are going to hear a lot more about it right now. Monika, thank you so much for joining us. It is great to have you here. How are you?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for this lovely introduction. Greetings from Johannesburg, South Africa. Excited to just jump in, whatever you'd like to start with.
Okay, perfect. We have so much to talk about. I want to talk about imagining better futures, how you do it, and then crucially, towards the second half of this conversation, how you can help other organizations and other professionals, including, of course, the people in this audience, imagine better futures too. Let's start, though, with these words that come up a lot when I read about you, when I watch other interviews you've given, this idea of utopia and dystopia, and this feeling that we have become stuck in this framework of utopia, dystopia, when it comes to imagining our shared future. So I have two questions about that. The first is, what makes you think that we are stuck in that framework? And the second question is, why did that happen? How did we become stuck in it?
Thank you. Really, really good way to start. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions, both about dystopia and about utopia. And there's very little other sort of accessible to mainstream frameworks that people think about in terms of future. So let's start with dystopia, all right? So dystopia is this idea of a future gone wrong. Everything is terrible in it, and so it's almost beyond repair. So now, historically, dystopias had a lot of significance, right? So back when we talk about the future visions, such as the Jetsons, they were not really inclusive. They were sort of utopian, but they were very, very uninclusive. And so the critique came from that sort of, from that standpoint. Dystopias were meant to sort of awaken us to the ways where maybe things are not going to be just like they were promised. And so they started off as cautionary tales, I think especially about dystopias such as written by Octavia Butler or William Gibson, right? They were sort of warnings of how things could be not as rosy, how they could go wrong. However, when we think about the moment that we find ourselves in today, and we think about most of the recent Hollywood science fiction movies, as well as TV series such as Black Mirror, these aren't really cautionary tales anymore. In some way, these have become a product roadmap, right? So what we end up with is a lot of companies, and sometimes nefarious individuals or governments, literally looking at these dystopian scenarios and saying, well, maybe this could be good for us. Maybe we could make a lot of money in creating these kind of products that in some way harm not just the little, not just parts of our population, but truly the majority of us. Right? So that's a real problem. And we can look at a movie such as Minority Report and what came out of what Peter Thiel came out with a company, Palantir, right? Profoundly racist predictive surveillance technology company that almost took direct product roadmap from that film. And then with a lot of companies like Boston Dynamics, and you look at the episode with the robot dogs in Black Mirror, and it's pretty much the exact kind of same product with the exact same kind of mission, even if in Boston Dynamics promotional videos, they'll make those robots dance or they'll make them a bit friendlier. But ultimately, the product roadmap is very similar. So that's one side. Another side, I think the effect, the very negative effect that dystopias have on our society is the moment we start believing that future is doomed, that future is decided by somebody else, somewhere else, we start disengaging with it. If we think that nothing can be made better, we just continue consuming. Right? And we disengage from politics, we disengage from the conversation around the kind of innovation that we want, the kind of innovation that we need, and the kind of innovation that maybe we don't want, and especially that we don't need, right? So dystopias today aren't really any more cautionary tales. In some way, they just perpetuate this doom and gloom and hopelessness and desperate escapism. So historically, in some way, utopias have been the answer to these negative future visions. But as we saw, actually, it almost started off with utopia and dystopia came after. But right now we're seeing it the other way. So whenever people see that these futures of doom and gloom are not something we should be embracing, then utopia becomes the answer. Well, let's imagine this sort of rosy, hopeful, green future vision. And most of the time people identify that as utopia. Now, utopia, the very word itself means a no place. So in some way, it's a place that cannot exist. But I want to reiterate a point that utopias historically actually have existed, except that those utopias were utopias for the few.
Okay, I want to jump in here. There's a lot. There's a lot going on in that answer. And one of my big questions, and one of the questions people out there will wonder is, given what you say about the power of dystopian visions to shape our future and the way that businesses, even some of the very famous businesses we know now, Boston Dynamics, seem to take inspiration from dystopian visions, why is Hollywood and why are science fiction writers seemingly so addicted to dystopia? Why are they so addicted to these dystopian visions? Is it just because bad news is more dramatic and bad news makes for a better movie?
Yeah, so there's a short answer and there's a longer answer to that. So the short answer, I think imagining doom and gloom, imagining end of the world is easier. We just extrapolate more of the same, more of all the negative tendencies that we see in the world right now. And then, more of that ultimately leads to dystopian scenarios. Also, I think it's much easier to do more of the same, even visually in terms of world design and visual effects. You just look at what has been done already and you make little tweaks on it, the same Pinterest boards, the same sort of references to the past, movies, TV series, video games, etc., etc. And again, you just tweak it, more of the same, and you end up obviously with something that is not entirely different. Right, so that's the short answer. It's easier for our imagination to think about bad things. It's easier indeed to tell stories of conflict if you just, if you just think of all the, how to say, even for example, so I've been very involved with virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. And in virtual reality, it's very easy to hijack our brain, janky as this technology has been, low resolution as it has been, if you make something very scary, right? If you make people, fall off a rooftop, if you have a monster chasing them. It's easier to overwrite our brain's defenses to the fact that this is virtual, this is not real, if we attack you in one way or another. Right? However, if you create some kind of beautiful, mesmerizing experience, well, it takes more imagination to create something beautiful, something truly inspiring, right? And then when the person is in a state of calm, they will see more of the details maybe that do not work, right? If they're not running scared from something, they'll say, oh, maybe this thing could be done better, or maybe that thing, is not high resolution enough or something like that, right? So that's one thing. But there's also another much bigger cultural reason. So who has been the main writers, producers, directors of science fiction in Hollywood? These were predominantly extremely privileged, cis hetero white men, right? So these were people at the top tier ladder of a society who have not really lived through real life dystopia. And so when somebody has not lived through a real life dystopia, in some way, it's an exciting fantasy to imagine. So for somebody that has never experienced real life oppression, real life totalitarian regime, real life being at the very bottom ladder of our society, it becomes an interesting thing to fantasize about that. However, when you have experienced that, right? When you have an experience of being a refugee, when you have experience of being a disabled person, when your ancestors have been enslaved people, when you have fled a war or other extreme conflict, or you are living, real life impacts of climate change, these become less exciting fantasies because you know that actually end of the world is not really that glamorous.
Certainly.
So,
yeah, I can see how, yes, I think those are hugely powerful reasons. So then my question becomes, and I think I know the direction you're going to go with this, are utopias the answer here? Do you want to see more utopian visions of our shared future? Do you want Hollywood to create more utopian visions?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, this is very relevant. So as we spoke about in the beginning, right, the utopia dystopia binary is seen as two opposing things. Whereas in my work and research, what I have really, discovered what I speak about is that these aren't two opposing poles. They're really just two sides of the same coin. So utopia generally is considered this idea of a beautiful, hopeful future. However, if we analyze it a bit deeper, in its very meaning, it means a no place, a place that doesn't exist. And when we analyze historical examples, we realize that most of the utopian constructs were utopian only for the very few, not for the many, and certainly not for everybody. Right? So Manifest Destiny, that was a utopian vision. Nazi Germany, that was utopia for the Aryans. Apartheid South Africa, that was utopia for the Afrikaners. But the price was always being paid, let's say in the case of South Africa, by everybody one shade darker than white. So generally, if we analyze historical visions of utopia, they have been exclusionary by default. They were designed by somebody at the very top, looking from that ivory tower into everybody below, and they had purposely excluded racialized minorities, queer people, disability community, etc., etc., etc. So in some way, utopia is eugenic by default. And I think that critique today of our society is really lacking. And that's why we keep juggling between these two opposing poles of dystopia. Everything is doomed, and so there's nothing we can do about it. And utopia, everything is so perfect, don't you dare question it, right? And so that's what led me to being dissatisfied with both of these frameworks and to try and find, well, what could be a third way? But a third way, not as something in between the two, but something as beyond these two. So
yes.
This is how the project Protopia Futures
Yes,
was born.
exactly. And that is exactly, this takes me perfectly to my next question, because that is exactly where I wanted to head. if utopia and dystopia are not the answer, and they are, as you say, to a certain extent, two sides of the same coin, and they don't get us very far, I'm fascinated to hear more about the framework you're establishing, which you call the Protopia futures. Tell us about that framework and how you've developed that, and what it's about, and how you're using that to imagine futures beyond this dystopia, utopia framework that we've talked about.
Yeah, so to start with the word, so Protopia was not coined by me. It was coined by Kevin Kelly in 2011 in a blog post. But it never really took off, because I think at that time, we as a society were not really ready to look beyond that dystopia-utopia binary. However, when I discovered it, I was really inspired by that word because it made me think about proactive prototyping of futures that are radically hopeful and inclusive. And the way to go about that, and by the way, Protopia Futures is not just me, it's a whole amazing collective. So if you look up Protopia Futures Design Framework, there's several dozen people credited as co-creators of the work that we do. And of course, our research is built on the shoulders and generations of people that have come before us. So how can we think about hopeful futures, and how can we think about radically inclusive futures? To start with, we need to look and be inspired and amplify the voices that have previously been excluded. And to do that, it's not some kind of charity work. In fact, if we want to make the future that is kinder and safer for most of us, we need to look at the people that are at the very front line of any kind of negative effect. So in our case, we are centering in our research disability, queer, and indigenous justice. Why this intersection of these three things? Well, if we look at technological innovation, what we realize that in fact, to look at disability and disability-led innovation is not some kind of charity work. In fact, most of the technology that actually serves people, that doesn't kill people, but actually makes our lives better, originates with disability-led innovation, right? So everything from the subtitles to being able to, any tablets, to being able to zoom in, to being able to, all the voice assistants, right? To be able to transcribe voice to text. This is all disability-led innovation. When we talk about future that is post-pandemic, and even the futures that should have been, discussed during the pandemic, if they were led by disability justice inspired approach, we wouldn't have seen millions and millions of dead people. Because if we would have first looked at the most vulnerable people in our society, we would have agreed on the kind of policies that make the world safer for all of us, rather than have negotiated this idea of herd immunity that has left not just millions, but truly tens and hundreds of millions of people newly disabled. When we talk about green futures, we need to not look into green corporate futurism. We need to look at indigenous justice movements. Because within indigenous justice movements, these are the people that have been living with the landscape and part of the landscape, not just for decades or centuries, but truly for millennia. And until we move past that human-centric design, that the landscape is resources that we can pillage, and we start seeing how none of it is just resources that we can pillage, but truly a world that we're inextricably tied with, we can't truly entertain the solutions that not only are sustainable, but actually regenerative. And regenerative they must be, because we have already caused so much damage that just sustainability is not enough. We actually need to repair that damage. And in order to do that, we must look at the answers proposed by people that are at the very first edge, at the very bleeding edge of the receiving end of the climate change, right? You know, I'm speaking from South Africa. We just had truly devastating floods in KwaZulu-Natal. In the Horn of Africa, currently, you know, people are experiencing some of the worst droughts. And so for us, climate change and biosphere collapse is not a theoretical future. It is a reality that is being lived by people today. And so if we start here, it will be safer and better for everybody. Now, today, there was a leak through the Supreme Court that Roe v. Wade might be overturned in the United States of America, right? So we're talking about pushing back women's rights by generations. And the reason why it's happening, I think, because for a long time, even if we think of examples such as Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, oh my God, you know, and TV series, you know, a lot of the times people were talking about it like this is some kind of scary possible future that could be happening. Whereas this is the future that has already been, this is the past. This is a future past that has been experienced by women of color in the United States of America for generations before that. So again, centering minority gender-based justice, centering queer justice is not something that would just serve queer people, women or trans people, but in fact would make a future safer for all of us. And I think these things are really key in everything that we do with Protopia, is to see who is really at the bleeding edge of receiving the future. How any technology that could be creating, you know, on one side, it can create positive change, but on the other side, it can create harm, right? And so we need to find the people who could be harmed the most by it. So that is a dystopian approach. And someone, we need to see who would be living the real life dystopia and then ask them how it could be made safer for them.
This is
it will be safer for all of us.
This is great, and that leads me on to the place I want to end on, because we're running out of time, very sadly, because this is fascinating. I'm so interested to hear some practical tips from you, like for the audience out there. If you're working inside a large organization, or maybe you're a startup founder, maybe you're working for an NGO, what are some of the practical things you can do? What are some of the practical things you do in your work as a futurist to bring those new futures to you, and to take those new futures to your colleagues and share them? Just sort of practical tips that our audience can use to help them imagine these alternate futures that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I think it's really about popping our filter bubbles, right? So if you are in the global north, you must make yourself aware of the kind of changes, the kind of innovation, but also the kind of harm that is being experienced in the global south. If you are a man, you must seek out perspectives of women and marginalized genders. If you're an able-bodied person, you must seek out disability as well as neurodiversity perspectives. And it's not about tolerance, right? To say that you are tolerant of others, it's really not enough. We actually have to become curious of others, of people that are different than us, who have different cultural, different gender, different generational, etc. perspectives. Because it's only us coming together that we will find the answers that we're seeking for. The crisis that we are facing is truly extraordinary in scale. And so it will take the multiplicity of perspectives and the conversations that really challenge the status quo to find and prototype alternative pathways. And so here, I really want to insist that, future doesn't happen somewhere else, and it's not decided by somebody else. The moment that you, as a listener, disengage, you allow others to decide it for you. And we are many. And if we come together and we insist that future is not something that happens somewhere else, the future is what we are creating. And every narrative that we tell ourselves and that we share with others, each of us have an audience. Sometimes the audience is just our family. Maybe it's just 5 people. To some of us, it's maybe 100 people. To some of us, it's maybe millions of people. With every single story about the future that we share, we are shaping the future that will come to be. And so for me, I think what is happening right now is disinformation warfare, be it regarding the pandemic or the current war happening next to my country of birth in Ukraine. I'm from Lithuania originally. Disinformation is something that can be weaponized so easily because these seeds of the so-called fake news or conspiracies, they find a fertile ground where they sprout, right? And so the only answer to that, as much as sometimes banning these different sources can help, it also is just like shoving things under the rug. Futures literacy is key. Each and every one of us has to become curious about the futures that are possible. How and who are they shaped by? And how with whatever thing that we do, whatever industry that we are in, we actually participate in it. And so I think with all the work that I do, it's really just about inspiring the curiosity of the future. And it's about inspiring people to look less into just sort of empty sci-fi entertainment and more see how science fiction narratives as well as futurist narratives actually allow us to prepare and prototype the kind of choices that each of us will be taking both in our personal and professional lives.
Thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating, but do not go away yet, because before we leave you, we have one more thing to do. We are about to travel to planet next one. So stay right there. Okay, Monika, imagine this. It is the near future. There is an acute crisis on planet Earth, and amid that crisis, a team of technologists hatches a plan. They want to travel far beyond the solar system to a new planet, next one, and there they're going to create a permanent base, a new home for humanity. And Monika, thanks to your achievements in the fields of futurism and futures design, you will be among the first 1,000 pioneers to go to this new planet. Before you go, there are just 5 crucial questions you need to answer. Are you ready, Monika, to answer those 5 questions?
I can try.
Okay, let's do this. I have faith. Question number 1, name one luxury physical object you'd like to take to planet next one.
I think it'd be my yoga mat. It's not really a luxury object, but I think something like that would be incredibly stressful, and I need a way to de-stress myself and keep bending my back.
I think that is an excellent answer, and I think you're right. It will be a stressful and probably a long journey. A yoga mat is a great choice. Consider it done. Question number 2. Name a book you think everyone should read before they board the ship and journey to planet next one.
Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Maree Brown.
Tell us very, very briefly why.
Adrienne Maree Brown is a non-binary author that centers Indigenous, Black, women and minority gender perspectives and disability justice. And I think it's very, very important that whatever future that we build is really grounded in that, and is grounded in this idea how activism and pleasure are 2 things that must come together. If not, then the future becomes too bleak and dark.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, question number 3. Name one exceptional person that you think should be among the first 1,000 people to go to next one.
I would think of Rua Benjamin, who's a Black woman technology ethics scholar. And I think her critical perspective on the future would be absolutely vital for such an endeavor.
Fantastic, thank you. Question number 4. Name a law that bans something from next one forever.
Extreme wealth and extreme poverty.
Wow.
Definitely.
Love it. Thank you. Okay, question number 5, final question. Name a tradition from planet Earth that you would like to see replicated on next one.
Indigenous perspective of seeing the landscape, so that nature and humans are not two separate things, but really we are one and the same, and our bodies are inseparable from the landscape. And we have to treat the landscape as we would be treating our own bodies, because we are not individual islands floating in space. We're really part of the world, and we can only be well together, not just together as people, but together as all life.
Thank you so much.
On Earth or on the other planets.
Thank you so much. That is a hugely inspiring note to end on. Pick up your yoga mat, journey to next one. We wish you well there. And much more important, thank you so much for being an amazing and fascinating guest on the show. It's been such a pleasure having you, Monika Bielskyte.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine. Much appreciated, your time and attention.
Thank you for being our guest today, and thank you for watching. Also, I would love to thank our partners Accenture Song and Factor 3 for their support. If you would like to meet us in real life, simply apply for a ticket for the next conference in September and join us there in Hamburg. I hope to see you there. Bye-bye.